Praise the Lord, guys. I'm Shaw Greenhorn. And Jesus answered and said unto them, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring thy son hither. And while he was yet a coming, the Spirit threw him down and tear him. And Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, and he healed the child and delivered him again to his father. Now the people, they were all amazed at the mighty power of God. And as they wondered one with another at all these things Jesus had done, Jesus said unto the disciples, Let this saying sink down into your ears, for the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men. And they understood not the saying, and it was hid from them, and they perceived it not, and they feared to ask him of that thing. So here is Jesus' response to the disciples trying to cast a devil out of a man's son. We've seen Jesus healed so far the entire time. We don't ever see him passing anything onto them, but we understand that he just went up into the mountain to pray with Peter, James, and John, and he was transfigured. And that's when, Moses and Elias appeared with him talking, and the cloud overshadowed them, and the voice said, This is my beloved son, hear him. So on coming down, he is met by, this great multitude. And this guy, he stands up. He takes a stand for his son, and he overpowers everyone with his voice and gets Jesus' attention. And he's, pointing out this fact, how he brought, he first of all, he described his son, how the Spirit taketh him, and he suddenly crieth out, and it teareth him, and he foameth again, and it bruiseth him, hardly healeth him. And how the disciples, they tried to cast it out, but they could not. So, we see Jesus here, his frustration, and, rightly so. He just sent them out two by two. He gave them power and authority over all devils and to heal all manner of sickness and diseases. So now, if they were unable to cast this devil out, I already asked the question, when they were sent out two by two, to do their thing without him, watching over them and supervising them, taking extra special care to see that, all things work out as it is supposed to. What roadblocks did they run in? What were they unable to address? Sometimes if you understand how the mind works, you don't know a thing, it can completely go over your head and you don't even know that it's in front of you. So, they could have, if this is happening right now, they could have encountered something, right? Where, it was in front of them right there and they didn't know what it was. They didn't even know that it was a thing. Or even worse, they thought they healed it and, they didn't. But because of their lack of, experience, their lack of, understanding and wisdom, their lack of the full picture. So after sending them out and them coming back, now they're supposed to be a little more seasoned, right? And, when he sent them out two by two, it was just two of them. So now he took with him Peter, James, and John. So that leaves 9, because there's 12 of them, right? So now there's 9 of these disciples, Judas included. Maybe that's why the devil didn't want to go. Because looking at Judas saying, You're a devil yourself, where are we going to go? So now instead of just having, 2, now they have 9, and they're unable. They're unable to pull their faith together. They're unable to reason out a solution. They're unable to go around the roadblock somehow. They're unable to break through the barrier. They're unable to improvise on the spot. They're unable to come up with anything. And now this man is left. Can you imagine the disappointment, having heard all these things of Jesus? Now, mind you, Jesus, he was not there. He was up on the mountain being transfigured. But then, coming with such great expectation, because he has not failed. Not once did he fail. The only, even challenge that he had was when he commanded the, I am legion, for we are many, to come out of the man. And instead of coming out, they besought him that he would send them out instead into the swine and not out into the deep, because they were by the lake. I mean, apart from that, everything went smoothly, it went automatic. There was no kickback, no scuffle, no wrestling. It was just easy money. So this father, he brings his son to these disciples with such great expectation, and watching them heal, try to heal his son. Them, how did it go? Did they call upon the name of Jesus? Did they rebuke the spirit? Did the spirit speak back? We see Jesus casting it out and it did not speak to him. So this doesn't seem like a speaking, to people, demons like the legion was. We know the 7 sons of Sceva who would try to cast the devil out and it would leap on them and, overcome them, and they ran out of the house wounded and naked. Were the disciples, in jeopardy of something like this happening to them if they were unable to cast the devil? So, now this father, having seen this, is he losing hope? Because maybe if they can't do it, maybe Jesus can't do it either. Who's to tell if this wasn't a sign of things to come? So, we're not given, we know that he was there overnight, right? Because it's in the morning that he came down, the next day, to, from the mountain to meet this multitude? Did they come early in the morning? Did they just come, or were they there, from yesterday, overnight, waiting with all this apprehension? Because now, they try to cast this devil out. So, imagine how agitated it must be, right? Knowing what their goal is for this devil. I don't imagine he's taking it, that well. Is he giving him, more fits? Is he coming on aggressive? Is he, trying to take a last stand to keep his host, this little boy? So we see Jesus being very, frustrated with them. And, it's not the multitude that he said this unto, it's the disciples. You must understand. Oh, faithless and perverse generation. Faithless and perverse, he called them. They had seen enough, right now, where they should have, understood, what he would have done next. What kind of mind frame were they, in, doing this thing. Like I said, Judas, was it because of him? Him himself being a devil, right? So he calls them, this. They just asked the question. The scribes and Pharisees asked him, why do the disciples of John fast often and make prayers, but thy disciples eat and drink? Even the disciples of the Pharisees, fast. But we know the Pharisees, when they fast, how they disfigure their faces to appear unto men to fast. They stand on the street corners, reciting long prayers. Jesus said, verily I say unto you, they have their reward. So we know that their fasting wasn't really worth anything. Even though there was maybe some that took it seriously and they did not do that, and maybe theirs, was respected. But as a general consensus, this is what he had to say about them. Maybe they should have been fasting, because he gave the answer: can you make the children of the bride chamber mourn while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when he shall be taken away. Then shall they fast. Because, ultimately we're going to see him give them the answer. This kind cometh out only by prayer and fasting. And since they were not praying and fasting, now, after Jesus fasted 40 days in the wilderness and was tempted of the devil, command this stone be made bread, fall down and worship, cast thyself down from hence. A recorded fast is not given. Another one, right? If you search all the gospels, you won't find another one. But, the fact that he goes up into the mountain to pray overnight, is he fasting during these times? Was the anointing that he got from this 40-day fast able to carry him throughout his whole 3-year ministry? I would ask that question if he did not fast again, because it's not recorded. So, we see the devil as it's coming to Jesus, it's starting to give a kickback, because, it knows that this is the master. Just like with the 7 sons of Sceva, the devil said, Jesus I know, Paul I know, but who art thou? So now here, this devil, it's coming to Jesus, and they know Jesus. So immediately he starts, fighting for dear life, screaming, trying to hold on to the walls as he gets dragged, through the hallway, doing the worst that he can. I would ask the question, was at this point, was he trying to, just, take the little boy's life? Because, he was about to be casted out. Was he trying to, do that? Even knowing that Jesus could bring him back, right? So we see Jesus, rebuking the spirit and healing him, then giving him back to his father. So now, no doubt, the scribes and Pharisees, they were down there, because in Matthew it said how they even disputed with the disciples. And, Jesus, he was concerned. He was asking them what they disputed about, fearing that they would give them a wrong or incomplete answer. So now they see, the disciples try to cast this devil out, and it doesn't happen. So now here's another thing that they will hold against him, How is it that your disciples are not able to cast these devils out? And who knows what direction they would have taken with something like. So the whole multitude, they saw the disciples fail to cast this out, and what kind of confidence does that leave in these disciples? Seeing them fail like this, or Jesus, he came down and he just did it just like that. We're kind of coming to a show where only the master is worth anything. Everybody else, they're just the hired extra hands. They facilitate, they provide security. They line the people up. They run through the cycle or the routine, but don't look for anything from them. And this was this could have been such a huge blow to them, because we know that he's gonna be taken. What happens when he's taken back to heaven and they come back here to this place, and the people remember them unable? Like I said, was this devil already not agitated and frustrated by this failed, casting out by these disciples? So now the element of surprise, even though they probably knew that, the little boy, he was being taken to cast, this devil out. So now, the disciples failing, now the element of surprise is gone. So we see the people, they're marveling, at the mighty power of God, and how they marveled one with another. But we see Jesus, looking at the disciples with a different emotion. Let this saying sink into your ears. And I believe that he's in full right to say it, in this, way unto them. Let this saying sink into your ears. Because, even as he tells them, right here, later, Simon Peter is gonna take him and rebuke him, saying, Lord, this shall not happen unto thee. That's when Jesus said, get thee behind me, Satan. Thou savorest not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men. At the Last Supper, when he said, all of you shall be offended in me this night. And, they even began to rebuke him. That's when he said to Simon, the cock will crow twice and thou shalt deny me thrice. When he was crucified, how they were so sad, they were so depressed. So, him saying it like this, I believe, and it still didn't work. As much as he said it like this, it still didn't work. Let this saying sink into your ears. And he told them of his betrayal, how he's delivered into the hands of men. I believe in the other gospels, it even says he will be slain and rise again the third day. We see them having a reaction onto this thing, being so afraid to ask him what it means, being so apprehensive. I mean, we already failed to cast this devil out, and we can tell that he's feeling a way about that we were unable to cast this devil out. I know here we are coming with another deficiency that we don't understand what you just said. Will you please explain that unto us? So, they're not looking so good right now. So they kind of just hold it, and swallow it. Because, we don't want to come with too many incompetencies. We don't want to come with too many, what if he starts reconsidering his position with us? What if he, gets so frustrated that he goes and looks for a different set of 12 disciples? Because, so far we're proving ourselves to be, ineffective. We're proving that, what value do we bring to this thing? Because we haven't seen him delegate anything unto them so far. It's always been him with the preaching. It's always been him with the healing. It's always been him casting out of devils. Whatever came up, it was always him. And now you're telling me that even after I trained you guys and sent you out 2 by 2 and you came back, that even after all of that, I can't rely on you for one thing. And we're about to see them give some wrong answers. When he tells them, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, they thought that he was talking about literal bread that we hadn't, is because we have taken no bread. The parable of, when they saw him eat with unwashed hands, and he said, it's not that which goeth, into the man that defileth him, but what that cometh out. He had to explain that to them 3 different times. He explained it to them on the spot. He explained it to them while they were walking to the house. And he explained it to them again when they got inside the house. So, a lot of things are showing about, them. All right, so how do we get here? Coming towards the, end part of the 9th chapter of Luke, where it started out saying, then he called unto him the 12 and gave them all power and authority over all devils and to cure all manner of sickness and diseases. And he sent them forth to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick, saying unto them, see that you take nothing for your journey, not save, not scrip, not bread, nor money. Neither have you 2 coats apiece. And whatsoever house you enter in, there abide and thence depart. And when you depart that city, whosoever shall not receive you, shake off the very dust of your feet for a testimony against them. So they departed and went throughout the towns, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard of all that was done by him, and he was perplexed, for it was said of some that John the Baptist was risen from the dead. Others said that Elias had appeared. Others said that one of the old prophets is risen again. But Herod said, John I have beheaded, but who is this of whom I hear such things? And he desired to see him. Now it came to pass when the disciples were returned, they showed unto Jesus all things that they had done. And he took them aside privately into a desert place belonging unto the city of Bethsaida. But when the people knew it, they followed him, and he received them. And he spake unto them of the kingdom of God, and healed all those that were in need of healing. And it came to pass, as the day began to wear away, the 12 came to him, saying, Master, send the multitude away, that they may go to the surrounding town and countries, and lodge and get themselves victuals, for we are in a desert place. Jesus said, give ye them to eat. They said, we have here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes, except we shall go and buy meat for all this people. Where there was about 5,000 men. So he told the disciples to make them sit down by 50s in a company. And they did so and made them all sit down. So then he took bread and took the 5 loaves and 2 fishes and looked up to heaven. He blessed and brake and gave to the disciples to set before the multitude. Now they did all eat and were filled, and took up of leftover fragments 12 baskets. Now it came to pass, while he was alone praying, and the 12 were with him, he said unto them, who say, the men that I am? They answered, saying, some saying John the Baptist, some say Elias, some say one of the old prophets. Jesus said, but who do you say I am? Simon Peter said, thou art the Christ of God. Now he straightly charged them and commanded them that they should tell no man that thing, saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the chief priests, elders, and scribes, and be slain and rise again the third day. And then he began to say unto them all, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Whosoever shall find his life shall lose it, but whosoever shall lose his life for my sake shall find it. For what is a man advantage if he shall gain the whole world and lose himself or be cast away? Whosoever shall be ashamed of me and of my words, of him shall the Son of Man be ashamed when he shall come in his own glory, and of the fathers and of the holy angels. But I tell you of a truth, there be some standing here that shall not taste of death till they see the kingdom of God. Then it came to pass, 8 days after finishing these sayings, he taketh with him Peter, James, and John up into a mountain to pray. And as he prayed, the fashion of his countenance was altered, and his raiment became white and glistening. And there appeared with him two men talking, Moses and Elias, who appeared in glory and spake of his decease that he should accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Simon Peter and all those that were with him were heavy with sleep. And when they awoke, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. Now as they departed, Simon Peter said unto Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. Now let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, one for Moses, one for Elias. Not knowing what he said. But while he yet spake, there came a cloud that overshadowed them. And as they entered into the cloud, they feared. And behold, a voice spake from the cloud, saying, This is my beloved Son, hear him. Now when the voice left off speaking, Jesus was found alone. And they kept it close and told no man in those days the things they had seen. Now it came to pass, on the next day when they were come down from the hill, much people met him. And behold, a certain of the company cried out, saying, Master, look upon my son, for he is my only child. For behold, a spirit taketh him. And he suddenly crieth out, and it teareth him, and he foameth again, and it bruiseth him, hardly departed from him. And I besought thy disciples to cast out, and they could not. So then we pick up right here where it says, And Jesus answered, say unto them, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring hither thy son. So, this rebuke is very, sharp unto them. It's showing that, you guys are not up to speed or where you should be. And I believe that it's the fasting, because, no doubt they pray. But, being Jews, you know how devout they are with their prayer, like the Muslims, right? That they pray at certain times that they are, religious and, mechanic, on schedule, with their prayer. They don't mess around with prayer. But, instances of them praying are not, recorded in the scripture. So that leaves us to answer, did they pray? Or or was it just left out? So, him having said this, we know he just said, to him that hath shall be given, he shall have abundance. But to him that hath not shall be taken away that which he seemeth to have. And I compared that, to motion when I did that video. How, if you look at the woman with the issue of blood, right, she spent all her living upon many physicians, neither could be healed by any. So we understand that she was pursuing her healing for a long time. And this journey of, frustration and setbacks, trying this thing, it failing, having hope, having it snatched away, getting more hope, having that snatched away, fighting through, hoping for an answer, traveling here. You see this motion, it built her faith. You see, by the time Jesus came on the scene, she said, you know what, if I but just touch the hem of his garment, I'm not even touching him. Up to that point, we didn't see anybody, get healed that he did not, directly touch, or he spoke the word over them. But she came out and she touched his clothes, the motion. So now, we understand that, Jesus, he does all the work, right? Like I said before, all the preaching, the teaching, the parables, the healing, the casting out of devils, the blind, the deaf, the leprosy, the withered hand, the palsy, all these things. He did these things, right? So, they were kind of like sitting on the sideline. And, it goes to show you that, unless you get your hands dirty, you can sit there the whole time and great things can be happening, in front of you. And we understand that these things are not forever, but it's for, a period of time. And, if you're not careful, when that period of time is over, then you're going to be left with nothing. Because now you have no experience, you have no, skin in the game, you have, no motion going, and you haven't, really tried anything. And, whereas if you were trying and failing even, you could get, correction, you could get feedback, you could get, direction, you could build something so that when you, separate from whatever this is, and now you're on your own, or even trying to, build your own, organization, whatever it might be, now you're at an advantage because you have all this, motion, going. So, oh, faithless and perverse generation. Now we know faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, right? They just answered the Christ of God, right? So, that question, he took Peter, James, and John, knowing that these were his 3 strongest. So he left the rest down there. Was this also a test? I know that if I leave these 3 with them, they're going to come up with, a good answer. They maybe get the job done. But what happens if I take away these 3? What's going to happen? Was this a test for them? So faithless. Substance of things hopeful. Faith coming by hearing the word of God. So now they were hearing new things from Jesus, not just the law of Moses, being repeated and even being expounded on. So them being and him decoding all these parables onto them, I would say is the inexperience that they had, they were just sent out two by two, like I said. But this was a one-time thing, and before that, they had not been, and we don't see them getting sent again until he is returned to heaven. And that's when they really go and build momentum. That's when they really go and to him that has shall be given, he shall have abundance. So he called them faithless. Because even maybe while doing it, they didn't believe that it was possible, or they didn't expect it to work. While they were doing it, they were, let me not put any words on it, but while they were doing it, there was something happening in their mind that made it, that much harder to work. Let me not label that thing, but let me just say that while they were doing it, something was going on in their mind, which made it, hard for them to do it. And then, we're reduced to perverse now. So now, faithless is kind of like, inactive, it's missing something. But perverse now is active. It's active in a certain direction that's not good. The parable he gave of the fig tree, he planted it, and many years he came seeking fruit and found none. Then he said to the servants, remove it. Why cumbereth it the ground and plant something else? They said, Lord, let us give it one more season. Let us, give it fertilizer and water it. If it doesn't produce, then he said, because he's expecting, a produce. He just spoke about the parable of the sower. Some seed fell by the wayside, some on the stony ground, some among the thorns, and some on good ground. And we are looking for this to bring forth something. So, giving them this opportunity to bring it forth and them fumbling the ball, this badly. We see him, snap, right to, timeless, reasoning, timeless judgment. Because now here we have this fig tree and it's not producing, And I also said one time that, remember, he's in charge of all things, right? He is playing so many roles when they are out. Because look at this, they can't even handle this much. He's leading the people, he's protecting them, he's feeding them, he's nourishing them, he's nurturing them, he's providing the structure, he's doing the organizing, he's doing the leading, he's doing everything. So remember, he is a human also. So, maybe this is just a moment of frustration, on his part, handling all the roles and seeming as if he's getting no help, because, their time hadn't come yet, their time hadn't come to take over, to lead, to be in charge of the gospel. But, in his frustration, maybe he, overlooked, this point. So, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? How long shall I tolerate this? I wish it were, as how I, was hoping for it to be. So bring thy son hither. So he's going to take over. And you see, I believe also in him taking this stance with them, he communicates, in the presence of this demon. He does not approve of what they did. He's not a part of what they did. He's not going to sugarcoat it. He's not going to take any stand for what they did. Even, be in defiance of them. This, it shows something that, I am not them. I do not, support that. So, it makes the demon know that he means business, right? Because if he's going to rebuke them like that and expect, production from them, if he's going to be so sharp with them, you and they are his disciples, you can't come and then, play jokingly as if, this is a continuation of what they were doing. No, this is, the master stepping in. So, this rebuke, it really shows, how he, separated from them. And no, you're not going to come and do the same thing. I have nothing to do with what they just did. All right, so the next verse says, and while he was yet a coming, the spirit threw him down and tear him. And Jesus rebuked the spirit and healed the child and delivered him again to his father. So now, this, like I said, this spirit, he's trying to hold on. You ever seen a person in a mental asylum and they're like, carrying him to the hallway and he's like grabbing onto everything, trying to not go down the hallway, maybe in the white jacket a little bit. And, he's trying to make himself look bigger, right? Animals in the wild, when a predator comes, they either run or they try to make themselves look, fierce and scary. And, this, devil, he's trying to make himself look, menacing. When they were trying to cast it out, maybe that's even a part of why they were unable. Maybe the devil did things to intimidate them, made the boy, drop down and foam and make noises. And maybe it scared them, right? And then when the devil sees this working, then he's going to say, so these are soft ones. I don't need to come out. I don't need to obey them. So now he's trying the same thing with Jesus. So while he was coming, he threw him down and tear him. To tear, it means that it put him in the worst possible place, mentally and physically that it could. It's like, throwing an egg against the wall. So Jesus, he takes control because, if this devil, figured out that he did not have to come out for them, he's going to more than likely try the same thing. So we're at a standoff here. So he rebuked the devil and healed him, healed the child. So we see two things happening. He rebukes the devil and he heals the child. Now, it just said that it tore him, right? So, two things happened here. He cast the devil out and he healed what damage the devil did. Did the devil damage him mentally? PTSD and scarring, was he gonna now go down a path of depression, after having suffered, something so dreadful, his internal organs, on his way out, you ever seen an employee that's fired and they call security to, escort them out? Because, some people, they start breaking things on their way out. So, this devil, he broke, what he could on the way out. So this was a twofold, deal for Jesus. Casting the devil out and then healed him. Jesus, he knows, for some reason, I will ask the question, when, Jesus is healing, something like this, does he know to individually, address each thing that's broken? Or does he send one command of healing to all things? All right, so he healed, the child and then gave him back to his father. All right, so the next verse says, they were all amazed at the mighty power of God. And while they were amazed, one with another at all the things Jesus had done, he said unto his disciples. So now they're in awe, celebrating, seeing this thing. We know that he's always traveling to new places. Maybe they hadn't seen, a demon casting out yet. I mean, imagine the father, how relieved he must be, because if the disciples failed, now he's extra, nervous and apprehensive. What if this means that this cannot be cast out? I've watched, and heard of all these people receiving good news. Will I get my good news? So then being amazed at the mighty power of God, watching, what is done for this little boy, no doubt, in those days, everybody knew everybody. And no doubt, a lot of the people, maybe knew a condition that they were facing, the symptoms that he described, how, he crieth out, it teareth him, he formeth, and it bruiseth him. There's that bruising, right? So, see this little boy get healed from this thing and, be okay for the rest of his life. In the Old Testament, we didn't see anything like this, being healed, no devils casting out, no situation like this. And to be lucky to be born and alive, in this, period of time. Because if you came 5 years before, you wouldn't have seen Jesus. He didn't come yet. 5 years after, he's going to be gone. But the disciples will still be around. So how lucky it is to be born, to be alive in this time that he is, there right now. How many died, waiting for something like this to heal them. And, understand that this is God, sending his son in full effect, showing these people, we know that God, he created the world, he made all things, and that, he can fix all things, but, we haven't seen it. We believe it and we've heard it, but we haven't seen it like this. The mighty power of God, they all marvel and, they were, talking one to another, of the things that he did, being amazed. But then we're going to see right now, Jesus, he's going to have a different emotion, for these 9 disciples. All right, so the next verse says, so he said unto them, let this saying sink down into your ears. The Son of Man shall be betrayed into the hands of men. The Son of Man shall be delivered into the hands of men, rather. So he comes, while everybody else is having a certain emotion. He is cleaning house right now, right? He's not too happy about what just happened, and him knowing all things, he probably knew how they would be unable to come to terms with his betrayal, what that he would get, and how everybody would turn on him. They even would flee and leave him. But he's thinking that if he implants it in their mind that it's gonna stay. And as we're about, as the story unfolds, we're gonna see that it does not stay. But him speaking differently to them, it shows you of the inner crowd versus the outer crowd. We know that those of value are in the inner crowd. Those of the outer crowd, they're given superficial things. They don't know what's really going on the inside. They don't know administrative things. They don't know the daily operations. They don't know the frustrations. They don't know the difficulties. Right? They just see things and they receive them on a more superficial level. So, he's, speaking to them in a serious way because he wants them to receive what he's about to say. So, did the people, while they were, being amazed at what he did and the mighty power of God, did they pick up on his body language? He's not too happy right now. He's not, celebrating with everybody else, for what was done. But he's getting ready to steer them in a certain direction. Right now he's trying to, define the parameters so that, when things come along, that they can be in a right expectation, that they can have a right measuring stick for what things mean. Because we understand that he was to come and die for our sins. And that would be the task, right? That would be the goal, even being referred to as his glory, his glorification, being crucified. But we'll see how they saw it as a weakness. They saw it as they took him and they killed him pretty much, and not that he came to lay down his life and to pay the ransom. No more bullocks and lambs and goats, sheep, turtle doves, pigeons, all these things. But his last sacrifice would be all we would need. So he's defining the game. He's letting them know that, hey, this is victory. I'm going to be taken into the hands of these men. Let that sink into your ears. He's really not too happy with them right now, and we see this coming across very, very strongly. All right, so the last verse says, and they understood not the saying, and it was hid from them, and they perceived it not, and they feared to ask him of that thing. So all right, so first of all, them not understanding what he said. They heard the words, right? But the meaning conveyed, they were not willing to receive it. They saw him as everything that he is: the healer, the deliverer, the restorer, the Son of God, and how everybody loved him. And they heard these things and they were trying to compare both pictures at the same time. The people loving him like they do, versus this what he's telling them, how he's going to be delivered into the hands of men. And they're forced to choose one thing, because these things are so directly opposite to each other. And since this is what's going on in front of their face, everybody loves him, everybody's receiving him. They're unable to see past what's going on in front of them right now, to perceive what he's telling them is coming. And I think that as a mature person, you understand that things can change at any moment, right? You can be up, then be down and so low. The next moment you can be low, and then something happened and you're on top of the world the next moment. It's only the mind that fears change, that's not so developed, that will try to hold on to whatever is in front of you. But we understand that times and seasons change. The scenery changes. When you're driving down the street, doesn't the scenery change with every distance you go? You see different buildings, different people, different cars, different things. And things they change, but they're caught up in the moment, right? And that's why he referred it in this way to them. Let this saying sink into your ears, because you guys are so caught up with everything that's going on. Forgetting even the very reason I came here. To give my life as a ransom for many. So they understood not the saying. It's not that they didn't understand it, but what it meant. They were unable to visualize, because you'd have to remove everything that's in front of their face right now. All these people that are thronging him and wanting to touch him, all of them have to turn their backs on him. So they understood not the saying, and it was hid from them. So the saying, it was also a hid. So understand that this was a divine hiding. We know that with Moses, when God sent him down into Egypt, he hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would not let the children of Israel go. God, he did that. This is kind of like the same thing. Because he's telling them this, and then it's saying that it was hid from them, right? And they perceived it not. So they perceived not that it was hid. So they were just completely, able to even picture anything going on. It might as well be speaking a different language. I'm Straw Greenhorn.